Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, blue pitchers, so stats, lasers, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm a useful idiot, and welcome. And I want to talk about the military budget in the United States, the so-called defense budget, and more specifically, the numbers that are thrown around about what the defense budget is, because it's always a contentious issue. And how much money do we need to spend on the military? And I've done plenty of videos on military spending, on what kind of weapon systems and whether it's necessary, and the expense and the waste, etc., etc. But when you get into the heart of the matter, there's some obvious glaring discrepancies that seem self-evident when pointed out of why the defense budget is in fact not 500 or 600 billion a year, but is more like $1 trillion or over a year. And this is a substantial difference, both numerically and psychologically. So just think about that for a minute. Think about the fact that the defense budget is actually over $1 trillion every year. And this is without getting into the existential discussion about the place of the military and what these extra expenses are for, when they're for pensions and benefits and that sort of things, veterans benefits. And this is noble to a certain degree. But let's get into these numbers. So we have the Department of Defense base budget discretionary, and that's what we hear about most of the time, and that's $495 billion. And there's some talk about what a huge drastic reduction we have in military spending coming up under the Obama administration, and it's actually not a reality. Adjusted for inflation and other measurements, it can be argued that the U.S. is at the same level of spending as 2005 under Rumsfeld, and this is counter to Rumsfeld's claims that the Obama administration is dangerously slashing the United States military capabilities, and that goes for Dick Cheney as well. This was the most military swollen budget in U.S. history in 2005 under the likes of Rumsfeld and Cheney, and the current status of the budget is not much different. And it's also not that much different, adjusted for inflation, as the military buildup under Reagan against the Soviet Union threat, also considered one of the heights of military spending in U.S. history. And supposedly the U.S. outspent the Soviet Union into oblivion. And this is also a higher amount than the height of the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So this idea that there's this massive reduction in military spending is a lie. So, and we also have to remember that the politicians have a lot invested in this industry, and every single state, there's work for the government and military that's been pieced out to every single state in the union. So every congressman, every politician has a stake in keeping the military-industrial complex going, keeping the money flowing, and that's why we will never see a reduction in military spending. It's essentially what keeps the economy afloat. And but we use this $500 billion basic defense budget as the figure to talk about. But let's get into what the other aspects are. And I'll attach below the whole list and a more lengthy discussion of this whole thing. So then we have the Department of Defense base budget that's mandatory for contributions to pensions and veterans benefits and the likes, and that's $6 billion. And then we have overseas operations. We know overseas operations include both the areas of conflict and just military action that the United States has going on in virtually every single country on the globe. And I have videos about that if you want to check into that further. And then, interestingly enough, the nuclear weapons program is put under the Department of Energy, so they separate that out. But if we add that back in, that's $20 billion that goes for the nuclear weapons systems in the United States. Then we have defense-related activities, and that's just miscellaneous. And that's $36 billion this year, because it's FBI overseas work, selective service work, and then Hagel created a new slush fund that goes into effect in 2015. It's $27 billion, and it's called the Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative, and essentially a military slush fund. And then then we get into the things that don't normally get included as part of the military budget and part of the defense budget that are glaring examples of things that should be part of the defense budget, or at least included when discussing the numbers for national defense. And one of those big ones is Homeland Security at $52 billion. And of course that includes the Coast Guard now, and it has a lot of redundancy with other agencies. So think about that, this $52 billion boondoggle that has been created, this money hole that Bush and Obama have fostered. And then we have the biggies. We have military retirement costs at $37 billion, and then we have retiree health care and veterans affairs at $161 billion. And those are legitimate costs for the Department of Defense and need to be included in the figure. And that's where we end up with this $1 trillion figure. And then also importantly, we need, as a good accountant, you need to include the military's effect on the overall budget, and specifically the share of interest on the debt. All this government spending, all this borrowing, there's a huge amount of extra money that's spent on the Department of Defense that's hidden in just their share of interest on the debt, and that's $82 billion a year. So, like I say, when you add up all these numbers, you come up with a defense budget that is around $1 trillion. And some of the spy agencies like the CIA and NSA and whatnot, they're rolled into the base budget for the Department of Defense. So those are already covered, but I would argue that there's a black fund, which is probably in the tens, if not 20s, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of black funds available to the CIA. And then there's also the generally acknowledged black budget of the Pentagon in general, a giant slush fund that is understood to exist but is never discussed, that exists out there, that adds another large chunk of money. And then we also have money that filters through these government corporate partnerships, these companies like Raytheon, who are essentially development centers for the government, for the military, and in some ways should be included in these defense budgets, and the subsidiary, essentially the subsidies that these companies get, and they're a symbiotic relationship with the U.S. military. And not to mention just research and development in general, like the support government money that's given to organizations like DARPA, who essentially develop massive technology for the military. And that goes for NSA as well. There's probably a black budget for the NSA, just like there is with the CIA. For example, funding the Utah Data Center. So all of this money added together creates a military defense, so-called defense offense budget of probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 trillion, I would put forth the idea. And when you think of it in that terms, it becomes all the more mind-numbing and all the more staggering. And not only that, but we have a military now where the Pentagon's civilian and military leadership is bloated to historic highs, full of career officer corps who look forward more to advantages, the same as politicians in this revolving doors. Officer benefits have skyrocketed in the last several decades, and many have lucrative revolving door jobs going into the news media as consultants, or more importantly, getting involved in the very defense industry and surveillance industries that they used to work with when they were in the military. And a lot of times they even found these companies. And then not to mention that equipment is outrageously expensive, and the government gets defrauded on all this. So all these ex-military men go and work for companies that defraud our government and our military to the tunes of hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, both in the war theaters in Iraq and Afghanistan, and just for military equipment in general. And the Pentagon generally remains unaudited, so they don't really have to answer for any of this. They don't have to answer for any of their money, and that's one of the ways they can create black budgets as well. And let's not forget that Donald Rumsfeld announced the day before the 9/11 2001 attack that the Pentagon had something like $2 trillion that was unaccounted for, and but people quickly forgot about that. But so there we go. There's a glimpse of what the real military defense budget is in the United States. And for anyone who's a warmonger, or anybody who's connected to the military-industrial complex, anybody who thinks that all the military spending can never be enough, take a look at the figures in reality and ask yourself if we still really think the kind of money the United States borrows and spends on a global empire and the resultant military and its expenses is worth it. Take a second look. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.